On the eve of the election in Afghanistan, the American military commander there is predicting victory, not for any candidate, but for his troops battling the Taliban. When will they win? Well, that's a tougher question. In an exclusive interview with the BBC, General Stanley McChrystal laid out his plan for a dramatic shift in strategy, even as a prominent insurgent leader also told the BBC that there could be no end to the fighting without an unconditional departure of foreign troops. Our World Affairs editor John Simpson is in Kabul.
General Stan McChrystal, Special Forces commander and now the man in charge of the faltering campaign in Afghanistan. He's very much the thinking man soldier, and he's planning to change things. He changed things in Iraq by tracking down Saddam Hussein and catching him, but Afghanistan is a far tougher proposition.
The situation is serious and we need to turn the momentum of the enemy, but we can do that. The Afghan people don't like the Taliban. It's not a popular movement. And so what we need to do is we need to correct some of the ways we operated in the past, and we need to show the kind of resolve that it's going to take to, and imagination in some cases, to operate smarter to do this right.
He soon had a chance to show what he meant. We've come to the town of Sarobi, east of Kabul. It's been a bad trouble spot.
One of the things, arresting people without any good information.
The governor, Qazi Suleiman, has two big complaints. The way NATO arrests innocent people who then languish in jail without trial, and the sometimes apparently indiscriminate bombing which kills civilians.
I agreed on the first point about detainees and casualties.
And he agreed on the second point too.
Over the last few months we've made tremendous efforts and an awful lot of progress, particularly in things like the use of lethal fire.
Sarobi is French Foreign Legion territory. Almost exactly a year ago, 10 French soldiers were killed and mutilated near here. But General McChrystal made a point of walking round the town.
For 20 years or more, Sarobi's been synonymous with violence and banditry of all kinds. So it's pretty surprising, really, to find that the commander of the international force can simply walk down the street here without body armor, admittedly guarded by dozens of Afghan and French and American troops.
Somewhere outside, though, are scores of insurgents, supporters not so much of the Taliban as of a different extremist group. Run by this man, Gulbuddin Hekmatyar. In a rare appearance, he answered questions sent to him by the BBC. If the international forces continue the war, he says, we'll have no alternative but to fight. All they've achieved in the past 8 years is carrying coffins. But many Afghans regard Hekmatyar as a war criminal. It's NATO's failure that men like him are still a force here.
You say the situation is serious. Are you going to win it?
We are. When? That is difficult to predict. I think we'll win it when we connect with enough of the Afghan people where they have finally said enough.
General McChrystal has said he'll give himself 2 years to see if his new approach works. The clock is ticking.
And for more on his interview with General McChrystal, I spoke to John Simpson from Kabul just a short while ago. John, did you get any sense from talking to General McChrystal today that they think this election might change the nature or the length of the NATO mission in Afghanistan?
I don't think there's any doubt that that's in General McChrystal's mind. He was too, I think, frankly, too tactful, too sensible, perhaps, to say something like that to me in public. But I'm sure that he knows that what happens tomorrow and what happens over the days that follow will mark the future in one way or another of this country and its relations with the United States and with other Western countries that are represented here. I don't think there's any doubt about that whatever. If the turnout is very low, if President Karzai doesn't do particularly well, then I think there's going to be a lot of questions asked in Washington, in London, in Paris and so on.
John Simpson in Kabul. John, thanks very much for joining us. President Karzai has urged all Afghans to defy the Taliban's threats and cast their votes tomorrow. British troops are preparing for one of their biggest challenges, to ensure that tomorrow's voting is carried out peacefully. Meanwhile, the Afghan authorities are asking the media not to report any attacks for fear of scaring voters. Caroline Wyatt reports from Lashkar.
British troops today on one of their last patrols in Lashkar before polling begins, showing a presence they hope will reassure the people of Helmand and deter the Taliban. More than 200 British soldiers have given their lives here to enable Afghans to live and to vote free from fear. But tonight, a quiet sense of menace still hangs over much of Helmand as people weigh up whether to risk going to the polls to decide their future. British troops will now be a less visible presence on the streets in Helmand, with Afghan police and soldiers providing the main security around the polling stations. But British soldiers are here on standby in case anything happens. Tomorrow, these women are daring not just to vote, but to stand as provincial candidates. Karima says she wants people in Helmand to take part, in the hope that by defying the insurgents, the Taliban's power to intimidate will crumble. But after the devastation of yesterday's suicide bomb in Kabul, some may not want to take the risk. President Karzai has told journalists not to report any fresh attacks, in case they frighten voters into staying at home. But Afghan journalist Safatullah Zahidi tells me he'll defy that too and report everything that happens, even though he and his family have had threatening phone calls from the Taliban. The last election workers have now been flown to the remotest polling stations on an RAF Chinook. Coalition support for the Afghans tomorrow will be more discreet, as this battered nation faces yet another test of nerve. The hardest decision for some, not which candidate to vote for, but whether to vote at all. Caroline Wyatt, BBC News, Lashkar in Helmand.
Well, free speech is something which Afghans did without for many years. This election is an opportunity for them to make their voices heard, though many face the threat of violence from extremists. We asked people on the street to share their hopes and fears about tomorrow's vote.
This year's presidential elections are important for us because for 3 decades Afghanistan has been destroyed. We need a servant that's legitimate and a real president. Afghans have suffered from every direction. We want the future president to pay a lot of attention to education and to rebuild after the destruction.
I want to see Afghanistan rebuilt on solid foundations. I ask for a compassionate, peace-loving and honest president with integrity. In my personal life, I wish for peace and security in Afghanistan. I hope for a secure environment where we can work, study and have a better life, like in other countries.
I personally won't take part because the process is unfair. The person who we vote for won't be elected because the president is chosen from before. It's not necessary for us to vote.
We should vote in this election for a leader who can serve us. Firstly, they should try to free our prisoners who have been wrongly locked up. Secondly, the Americans shouldn't be allowed to come and search our village without the approval of the mullah and the village elders. Afghan National Police and Army should carry out the searches. Raiding in the night by Afghan Army and the Americans are not acceptable to us.
I have my polling card and I want to take part, but my family doesn't allow me. They say the situation in Afghanistan on election day is unstable and something might happen. So even though I have the card, they don't let me take part and vote.
After the presidential elections, whoever wins, I hope to see peace and security in Afghanistan. I hope for these things and long-term success, so that I can help my country and people.
And we will, of course, have full coverage of that election tomorrow.
Afghans have been voting in the presidential elections. It's only the second time in history they've been able to choose their leader directly. The poll is considered a key credibility test for the country. The first results are still some way off, but the day's been overshadowed by Taliban attacks, patchy turnout and allegations of fraud. Our correspondent Ian Pannell reports from Kabul.
An anthem for election day. Rousing patriotic songs urging people to do their duty and vote. But is anyone listening? The streets of Kabul are almost empty today. Fears about security are keeping shops closed and many people at home. But we met one family over a breakfast of warm bread and tea.